A little proclamation from the Auditor of the state of Ohio. Maybe it'll help get our money taken. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you for having me. My name is Cameron Lowery. I'm the regional liaison for Ohio Auditor Keith Faber. I represent him in 12 different counties, and Meigs County is one of them. Before I present this proclamation, I'd like to sit here and acknowledge that, at least we're not smoked out today, so that's a good thing. But I am also a member of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and I had the opportunity of coming here and speaking on behalf of the department commander a few years ago, and now I'm here on different business, on a official business, I should say, representing the state today. So I would like to present this proclamation. I'm not going to read all of it because a lot of it deals with the history, but I will read briefly the recognition here. It says, in recognition and appreciation of the Battle of Buffington Island commemoration ceremony, I recognize the Battle of Buffington Island commemoration in honor of all who work to preserve the memory, history, and lasting significance of this defining moment in our state and our nation's past. And this is signed by Keith Faber, Auditor of State of Ohio. And I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. I would like to thank the preservations and the foundation for all the work that they do, American Battlefield Trust as well, because they are preserving this battlefield for my generation, for future generations to come, and eventually this battlefield will be a landmark for visitors coming to this state of Ohio and in this region. I'd like to thank you all for all that you do. Thank you so much. Thank you. There's another proclamation here. Wow. Doing good. At this time, I'm going to introduce David Mowery, who's going to give a history of the battle. Now, he wrote the book, so if you want to know anything about the Battle of Buffington Island, he's the guy to ask. And I might say, if you are interested in a tour, David or Daryl, they have tours, because the battle did not take place where you're sitting. This park wasn't here. The battle didn't take place here. It was a running battle, and he can tell you more about that, but they do conduct tours. And Light mentioned that in his talk about the tours. So, there you go.
Thank you all. It's a great honor for me to speak before you about the history of Morgan's Raid, Buffington Island, and also Marietta Militia. I'll spend a few minutes on all those. Basically, I want to start first of all with what happened. What are we trying to do here today? We want to start to say we're here to commemorate and remember the men of both sides who toiled, fought, bled, and died on this field. Both sides were Americans all, and we got to remember that. Not just one side or the other. We also have to remember the civilians who were affected here. Civilians for 3 miles down this valley lost property from this battle, and they were affected for years to come. We remember them. We also remember that Morgan's Raid was the longest raid of the Civil War. It was one that affected the state of Ohio, the state of Indiana, no other way that any Civil War action occurred. It was the only Civil War major action that both states experienced during the Civil War. So Morgan's Raid had a profound impact on the people of those states and how they voted in the 1864 election. So it had an impact on the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1864. So let's start with the raid itself. Why did it even happen in the first place? Why did Morgan make this raid into Union-held territory? It started with the fact that Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, the largest Confederate army west of the Appalachian Mountains, was in dire straits. They were being confronted by a large army out of Nashville, and there was another large army brewing in Kentucky under Major General Ambrose Burnside, who was headquartered in Cincinnati, the Department of the Ohio, one of the largest departments in the entire Union. And Ambrose Burnside was building this new army called the Army of the Ohio that would invade East Tennessee and outflanked Bragg out of Middle Tennessee. Bragg could not afford to do this. To lose the state of Tennessee was definitely going to be the end of the war in the West. They lost Tennessee. They lost a lot of its manpower. They lost a lot of its infrastructure. So it was a really important thing for Bragg to hold Tennessee. So he was looking for a way to divert Major General Ambrose Burnside's attention. Keep this army in place in Kentucky, not allow it to invade East Tennessee. Here comes Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan, who's a famous cavalier. He's a famous raider. What we would call today special operations. Back then, we didn't have any such thing as special operations. Majority of the war we fight today is special operations. When we fight in the Middle East, it's special ops. Back then, they had no clue what it was. In fact, it was a derogatory term. They called them guerrillas, which back then meant bushwhacker. They'd lump them in with negative people. But Morgan was an expert at special operations man type of work. His men were trained this way to be raiders, and they were offering to invade Kentucky and even go beyond into Indiana, Ohio to divert the Army of Ohio's attention and keep it within the state. Bragg gave Morgan the option to stay in Kentucky, but he did not give him the permission to cross the Ohio River into the states of Indiana and Ohio. However, Morgan felt that if he was going to divert an army of 15,000 men, with his roughly 2,500 men under his command, he was going to have to go into the north. He was going to have to disobey his direct commander's orders. So by doing so, he kept it quiet, and Morgan invaded Kentucky on July 2nd, 1863 at Birchville, Kentucky, with his 2,500 cavalrymen, 4 pieces of artillery. That's all he had. And he headed into Kentucky and faced Burnside's cavalry in Kentucky. Got past them and started what began a giant chase. The best way to look at it, where Morgan is the fox and the Union cavalry are the hounds. And that chase continued into Indiana, where Morgan disobeyed Bragg's orders and crossed the Ohio River on 2 captured steamboats. And Indiana saw its first major Confederate force in the entire war and be the last Confederate force on the state of Indiana soil. On July 9th, 1863, when that happened. By that time, Morgan was down to 2,100 men. His men were traveling at an average pace of 40 miles per day, 21 out of every 24 hours in the saddle. The Union Army chasing him was under General Edward Hobson. He had roughly 2,500 cavalrymen. They were doing the same. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Well, Hobson had faced Morgan before in the war, and he said, well, if I'm going to have to capture this man, I'm going to have to do what Morgan does. So these Union soldiers, too, were traveling at that same pace. And as a result, they were using up horses. So horses were the common thing being left behind and also stolen from civilians in order for both Confederate forces and the Union forces to keep up with each other. On July 13, 1863, after traveling roughly 400 miles, the Confederate forces entered the state of Ohio at Harrison, Ohio, just northwest of Cincinnati. Morgan did a spectacular night ride in the night of July 13th to 14th to get around the largest city west of the Appalachian Mountains, other than New Orleans. And he did so successfully, getting around Ambrose Burnside's headquarters, city, and the 10,000 militiamen who were there to defend the city of Cincinnati and Hamilton, Ohio. He did that without any bloodshed. Morgan lost barely 60 men in that ride around Cincinnati. But as he traveled east, Morgan told them now that he's diverted the attention of the Army of Ohio's entire cavalry force in the western part of the state of Kentucky. He had done what he had to do. He had stymied the Army of Ohio. He had kept them from moving into East Tennessee. Burnside's whole attention was on Morgan. And so Morgan was hoping to get across the Ohio River and end the raid. And he chose this place to do it, Buffington Island. Buffington Island is located right behind you. It's a long island, about half a mile long. It has 2 fords in the Civil War, but they're all low water fords. One's called the upper ford, one's called the lower ford. And at the lower ford is what his target was. That was the easiest ford to cross with his horsemen. At least that's what he thought. As he neared this spot on July 18th, 1863, did not realize that that ford was going to be his nightmare. And the reason for it was the Marietta militia. On July 15th, 1863, at Marietta, Ohio, there was a camp there called Camp Marietta. And the commander of that camp was Colonel William R. Putnam, Jr., who was the grandson of Rufus Putnam, one of the founders of Ohio. And Putnam was a patriot, and he was going to do everything he could to stop Morgan from crossing the Ohio River into what was then West Virginia, but barely turned West Virginia, only a couple weeks earlier. It had been Virginia soil, so there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers over there on that other side. And so Morgan, if he got across the Ohio River, he was going to go back to Confederate lines very easily. However, Putnam had a different idea. He was going to raise as much men as he could to stop Morgan as best he could. Now, he realized he couldn't stop roughly 1,900 veteran Confederate cavalrymen with the men he had in that Camp Marietta, but he was going to try. He had 250 men he could round up. That would be called the Marietta Militia. They were all at Camp Marietta at the time. Couldn't afford any time to get any more men outside the city. So, those 250 men were made up of mostly local folks. Men who had never seen war before. Most of them had never seen war before. These were farmers, shopkeepers, factory owners, ordinary people, ordinary men. Had their own rifles. They brought squirrel rifles from the early 1800s, for the War of 1812. Superior rifles they did not have compared to Morgan. These men were putting their lives on the line to do what Colonel Putnam needed to do, and that's delay or stop Morgan. And some of them were out of not just Washington County, where Marietta is located. Some were around Athens County and surrounding counties, but the Athens County representatives in that 250 men were interested. Company A of the 129th Ohio Infantry was formed out of Athens County. They had just been mustered in at Camp Marietta less than a week earlier. They were under the command of Captain Frederick Hazen Stedman, who was a printer in Athens, Ohio, and he was also the sheriff of Athens County. He had just been elected sheriff in 1861. He led this new company of what we would call regular soldiers into war with the Marietta militia, alongside these men who were just normal civilians coming out of the area around Marietta, including men like Major W.J. Bloomfield, who was a captain at the time. He was a local Marietta resident. We also have Captain Israel Pitt Putnam, who's also of the Putnam family. He was a veteran, but he was a veteran of the 1st West Virginia Artillery, but he had been forced out of the artillery in February of 1863 because of his poor health. But he was there and willing to give his life to save Marietta and to prevent Morgan from crossing the river. So he was here with 50 men, and also Lieutenant A.T. Nye, who owned a foundry in Harmar, Ohio, just across the river from Marietta. He brought 2 cannon with him that had been made at that foundry, 2 iron cannons that existed all the way up to World War II. So this ragtag group, they formed a redoubt about half a mile south of here at the middle or lower fort, and they came here on the night of July 17th and 18th, and they dug the entrenchment on the morning of the 18th, had it finished when Morgan's first troops arrived around 8 p.m. on July 18th, 1863. Immediately, Morgan's scouts, all veterans, went down to the ford to see what was there. And here, what do they see in the oncoming darkness? A redoubt with 2 cannons behind it and an undetermined number of men. What was funny is this group of men, led by Captain David L. Wood, who was former quartermaster general of the state of Ohio. He was from Cleveland area. This man knew war very well. He had outfitted most of the Union regiments up through 1862. This guy knew how to dispose of his men, and he set these men in a way that would confuse Morgan's troops into thinking they had more than 250 men facing 1,900. And it worked, because the darkness came. Morgan had to make a fatal decision that night. We can't attack at night an undetermined Union force guarding the ford. We can't afford to cross the river because there was an unusual 20-year flood of the Ohio River at that point that raised the river from 2.5 feet to 6. And they couldn't ford that night because they would lose too many men and drown in crossing the river. And on top of that, they had wounded and they had artillery to get across the river. So with all those considerations in mind, Morgan decided they were going to camp that night here in the Portland Bottoms, about a half a mile north of this spot, around the Bald Knob Stiversville Road. And there, they camped that night. The men of Morgan's division, knowing very well they were in big trouble. They knew the Union soldiers of Thompson and now Henry Judah, who had a brigade of cavalry coming up by river from Portsmouth, they were going to converge on them, and they would probably destroy them. They were totally outnumbering the Confederates, nearly 3-1. So, with that in mind, these Confederates slept very restlessly that night, but then the battle occurred, 5:30 in the morning next morning. But before that happened, before the morning battle began, the Marion militia stood their ground there at that redoubt, waiting for Morgan's troops to attack, but the attack never came. They were sweating bullets, to say the least. But at midnight, they got an order from General Lycombe Scammon, who was commander of the famous Kanawha Division of the Union forces. He was positioned in Ravenswood, West Virginia, and that order came up for Marietta militia to disengage and retreat. It came at midnight on July 18th, just in time. And to say the least, these men were very anxious to get away. But before they did, they rolled their 2 cannons over the side of the hill where the marker is going to be placed, where the redoubt stood. That's where this marker is going to be located. And crossed the chute over to the island and went over to a steamboat that was hidden on the opposite side of Buffington Island, out of view of the Confederates. It was the steamboat Starlight, which had been carrying flour in the previous morning. It had run aground, and the Marietta militia was able to get it off the sandbar and then take the steamboat that night down to Ravenswood and reach safety, under the cover of the Union gunboats who were coming up from Ravenswood and were parked at the bottom of the island. So, these men got away, and when the morning came, Morgan's troops were surprised to find the redoubt had no men in it. And they were very upset because they could have started the fording process a lot earlier. But they did start the fording progress, but immediately at 5:30, within an hour, Judah's brigade of Union cavalrymen from Portsmouth attacked in the fog and pushed Morgan's troops all the way past this point where we're standing. There was actually a second battle line of Confederates right here, so there's the correct joke. There was some battling here, but they fell back to what is called the 3rd Confederate defensive line at Bald Knob Stiversville Road, and what is today State Route 124, which did not exist at the time of the battle. There, the worst nightmare could have possibly happened to happen. Not only did the gunboats show up and start firing on them from the river, two U.S. Navy gunboats under Lieutenant Commander Fitch, who was the inventor of our modern convoy system used in the U.S. Navy. He started firing into them on that flank. You have Judah in these fields here to the south, and now Hobson shows up with the Ohio and Michigan brigades, and they end up running into Morgan's right flank. So now Morgan's surrounded on 3 sides. 3 sides. And he has no choice but to retreat from the valley. And he does. Somehow he gets nearly 1,050 men out of this valley out of its original 1,900. Another 140 men get across the Ohio River on their own. So, roughly about 1,200 to 1,300 men escape the battle here, and the Union don't catch them until later. So the battle lasts about 2 hours. It wasn't very long. It stretched a 3-mile length of this valley. From the south to the north is 3 miles. From the east to the west, it's about 1 mile wide. So the battle is a very expansive place here because it's a running battle. And what's very interesting about this battle is the Confederates had no ammunition left. They had barely 5 rounds per man, and the artillery they had only had 3 rounds per gun. Whereas the Union guns, the Union cavalry, the Union artillery were well stocked. As a result, the Union just had more firepower. They had almost double to triple the number of men. And then comes the infantry on steamboats under Rutherford B. Hayes and Malachy Scammon of the 9th Kanawha Division. Rutherford B. Hayes led a brigade unit from 23rd Ohio. Lieutenant William McKinley, both presidents of the United States after the Civil War. So they did not get engaged, but they were used as support troops for Judah's cavalrymen in the latter stage of the battle. By the time the battle ended around 7:30 in the morning, Colonel Duke, which was Morgan's right-hand man, had been captured. Several of Morgan's officers had been captured, and by the time 24 hours elapses after the battle, Morgan loses close to 700 total casualties, mostly captured, but he had 57 killed, 63 wounded on the field, and 71 captured on the field. The rest that were captured off the field as they were trying to escape. As special ops men are trained to do, they're trained to escape on their own, to be able to think on their own. Whereas on the Union side, Hobson and Judah and the U.S. Navy, they lost a total of 6 killed, 20 wounded. Many of the Confederate dead are still buried on this battlefield. We know that from our observations and research, and as well as some infrared work we did back in the 1990s. So this battlefield is still a graveyard of Confederate soldiers. So we remember this battle, which didn't end the raid. Morgan ended up taking roughly 1,100 men off this field, which whittled down to, by the time he reached West Point, Ohio, about 10 miles from the Pennsylvania border, he only had 364 men left. And he surrendered to Major George Rue of the 9th Kentucky U.S. Cavalry on July 26, 1863, which made it the longest raid of the Civil War, exactly 985 miles from where it began in Brooksville, Kentucky. So that is the history of the raid, the history of Marietta Militia, and I hope you got some information here that you can take with you. There's some wonderful photographs of William Rufus Putnam and David L. Wood, who commanded the Marietta Militia here on the battlefield. They're back there. Take a look at them. They're heroes to us, of course, for keeping Morgan at bay for a night. And really, when you look at the role of the militia raid from Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, the Marietta Militia had the greatest impact of any militia group during the raid. So it's really a great honor that I was able to research and write this marker for the benefit of generations to come, as well as you, of course, and to remember their role in keeping Morgan on this battlefield so they could be defeated the next day on July 19th. So thank you very much for all your attention.